Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you this morning about a principle called a restrictive covenant. I received a phone call from one of our agents the other day. By the way, most of the material that I cover on these videos from week to week arises from situations that come up that our agents face. And I feel like if one agent encounters something that's problematic, it's probably something that other agents are going to run across, and it may be of interest to them to see how we handle it. So this particular one, the salesperson was listing a property, and the seller said, the only thing is I don't want the person who's buying it to use it for student housing. The interesting thing was he had a student accommodation across the street, didn't want the competition. So the listing agent, or proposed listing agent, said, how am I going to accomplish that? So we kicked around some ideas. They said, well, maybe we can put it in the agreement of purchase and sale, something like the seller and buyer hereby agree that upon closing and at any time thereafter, while the property is in the hands, either directly or indirectly, with the buyer, the property shall not be used for the purposes of providing student accommodation. Now, the problem with that, however, is an agreement of purchase and sale is like a schoolmaster. It brings it to a particular point, to closing, and then the agreement of purchase and sale ceases to exist as a legal entity. That's why when you put a warranty in agreement of purchase and sale, you say it shall not merge on closing. It'll survive. So maybe in this particular case, you could put something like that in the agreement of purchase and sale, and the lawyer on closing could write up some kind of a side agreement that the buyer signs and the seller signs that ties in some kind of a penalty if it's breached, that the seller agrees not to use it for student accommodation. I think it's more psychological than anything else, where the buyer is making a commitment. Well, I understand, and I'm not planning on doing that. But it creates a bit of a problem. The real solution, the permanent solution, is what we call a restrictive covenant. Now, a restrictive covenant is something that's negative in nature. In other words, it says, thou shalt not. You won't use the property for this particular thing. In other words, a restrictive covenant can't be you must do such and such. It's that you must not do such and such. So you create a restrictive covenant, and then you actually place that covenant on title, and it means from that day forward, that property cannot be used for a specific example. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's suppose that I owned a 10-acre parcel of land in North St. Catharines. Suppose it was adjacent to my property. My family had it as a farm years ago, and I had kept it vacant, and I enjoyed wandering around in it, having my dog run in it, maybe chipping golf balls in there or whatever. It was kind of like my own personal park. It wasn't a part of my property. It was separated. There was a different ownership legally, so it wouldn't merge, but it was property I owned. And I decided that I am going to will it to the city. I'm going to give it to the city, but I want them to have it as a park. Now, I can't dictate that it must be a park, but I can dictate that it will never be used for urban development. So I create that, and I place it on title as a restriction on title that moving forward, that property can't be used for development in any way, shape, or form. And you say, well, Wayne, why don't you just get the city to do a zoning change? Why don't you just get the city to designate it as green space? The problem with that is that zoning can be very easily changed. The city can come along and they can do an official plan amendment. They can do a spot zoning change. They can change it at some point in time. And if it's a restrictive covenant, they can't. So I can establish it that way. I can place it that way. And the property can never be used as student accommodation. The property can never be used for urban development. I've created a restrictive covenant. The problem is, if it ever gets to the point where we want to get rid of that restrictive covenant, it's a very difficult procedure to do. Let's suppose I'm done and gone, and my heirs, I have no interest in that, what happens with that property. It's not theirs any longer. It's not that they have any financial interest in it anyway, but they don't care. And the city says, you know what? We've got lots of parks. We don't need more parks, but we really need more housing. And this is a fabulous opportunity to develop a subdivision in here in this 10 acres, and it would give us all kinds of revenue. So we would love to do urban development. Well, how do they undo a restrictive covenant? It's not simple. It perhaps can be done, but it's not simple. They have to go through a process. They have to find a sympathetic judge. They have to present their case and show that the restrictive covenant that's on the land is no longer valid or useful. It doesn't make any sense any longer. It's not easy to do. one of the things that can be done is that you can put a restrictive covenant on a piece of land for a particular period of time. Developers may do this. They're developing a subdivision and they want all the time it's being developed to have some restriction on what owners can do with the property they buy. And so they may put a restrictive covenant on the land for some particular thing for, let's say, 10 years. At the end of 10 years, the restrictive covenant runs out and it's gone. And that makes a lot of sense. So I want you to be aware of restrictive covenants, be aware of its use, the potential for a restrictive covenant, beware of the danger of a restrictive covenant, and it can sometimes solve a problem, but it can also create a problem, and you need to be watchful for it. You're not going to run across it very often, but when you do, if it happens to be on title, you have to assume that that's going to really limit, you remember the bundle of rights, limit the bundle of rights you have in that property, and you can't, moving forward, overstep whatever that restriction is on the restrictive covenant. I hope that makes sense. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to talking to you again very soon.